The book of 2 Timothy. What is the book of 2 Timothy about? Well, the book of 2 Timothy is the very last letter that Paul wrote. He wrote about 13 letters, and this would be his final letter. He wrote it from a place of imprisonment. He is in his second imprisonment in Rome, and he is about to die. We know he is about to die because 2 Timothy 4 and verse 6, he says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. And you'll remember he already wrote a book to Timothy, the same individual who was pastoring in Ephesus, called 1 Timothy. And in 1 Timothy, he was teaching him how to set the church in order. And now 5 years have passed. And Timothy is thinking of quitting. He's thinking about throwing in the towel. I like to call Timothy timid Timothy because a lot of things had unsettled him. First of all, he was young. He was sickly. Beyond that, his mentor, Paul, had been thrown in prison. And Timothy probably thought if he's too much like Paul, he'll get thrown in prison too. And Nero is now on the throne and has brought in the first empire-wide persecution from Rome against Christianity. And so you can see how Timothy was already overwhelmed in his task of pastoring the church at Ephesus, the key strategic church of the first century. And with all of these other factors, he's thinking of quitting. And so if Timothy quits, then Paul's message can't make it to the next generation. And Timothy is Paul's last hope in terms of making sure Christianity makes it to the next generation. So all of that being said, Paul writes a book to Timothy to teach this young man to endure. It's not a book about getting Timothy saved. He's already saved. He's called Paul's son in the faith. It's getting him to endure in the task that God had given to Paul and consequently also to Timothy. And so Paul writes this 4-chapter book to teach Timothy to endure at his task. And the book has 4 basic parts. Chapter 1, you'll discover there a generic or general call to endurance. Then he moves into chapter 2, and this is where he moves from point to picture. And he gives about 10 metaphors for what true endurance looks like. And Paul uses many examples there, 10 metaphors or word pictures. The example of a teacher, the example of an athlete, the example of a farmer, a vessel, a workman, and so forth. And then you move into part 3 of the book, which is chapter 3, verse 1, through chapter 4, verse 6, where Paul warns Timothy about a great apostasy that is coming, which is going to make his job of enduring even more difficult. And the apostasy simply means a departure from known truth. Paul has sort of developed this a little bit in 1 Timothy, but now he gives more details about this last days apostasy of the church in chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 6. And so in chapter 3, really about verses 1 through 13, Paul unfolds the characteristics of the apostasy. How men in the last days, not in the world is always like this, but in the church are going to go from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived, and they're going to become lovers of themselves. And Paul tells Timothy what to do in the midst of the apostasy. And one of the things he tells him to focus on is the Scripture. He's got to be more aggressive and assertive in preaching the Scripture in season and out of season. And then finally, the book concludes chapter 4, verse 9, really, through the end of the book on how God met, I would say 6 needs in Paul's life. His need for shelter, his need for companionship, his need to be spiritually fed, his need for warmth. Even a relational problem between Paul and John Mark got resolved. And Paul's point simply to Timothy in rehearsing all of this biographical information is, if God helped me when I was really down and in my second imprisonment, then He'll help you, Timothy, as well. So you put all this information together, and it's a wonderful book about endurance in the ministry, in your task, in the midst of great difficulty.